Okay, so you've given us a pretty hefty chapter all about adulthood, huh? Seems like you want to get a really good grasp of this whole stage of life.
Yeah, definitely lots to unpack here. It's interesting how this chapter kicks off with a quick story about backpack preferences to kind of set the stage for this complex topic of personality.
Oh yeah, that totally grabbed my attention too. It's crazy how these little details can reveal so much about a person. And speaking of personality, this chapter dives right into the big five traits, right? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Yeah.
And get this, it suggests that these traits are pretty stable throughout our adult lives.
Yeah, and it really makes you think about how those traits kind of guide us down different paths. Someone who's high in openness might gravitate toward creative fields, always searching for something new.
Right, constantly seeking new experiences.
Exactly, whereas someone high in conscientiousness might thrive in more structured roles, where planning and organization are super important.
It's like each trait is a little nudge in a certain direction. So where do you think you fall on those scales? And how do you think that's played out in your own life choices?
Hmm, that's a good question. I'll have to think about that.
Oh.
Now, the chapter also gets into this whole idea of the search for connection, how adults go about building those close relationships.
And it doesn't shy away from the fact that the traditional view of marriage is evolving. I mean, did you see that statistic about the rise of living apart together, especially among folks over 50?
Yeah, that's a big shift for sure. While some couples do great in those LAT relationships, others really value living together or getting married. It's really fascinating how this chapter emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to relationships.
Absolutely. What matters is figuring out what works best for each person and each couple.
Yeah.
And the chapter also points out how beneficial those strong partnerships are, regardless of sexual orientation.
Right. Research keeps showing how important those close relationships are for our health and happiness.
Yeah, it makes you realize how crucial those connections are for riding out all those ups and downs life throws at you. And it's not all about romance either. This chapter really stresses how important friendships are, especially as we get older.
It seems like we tend to have a smaller circle of friends as we age, but those friendships become even closer. Those strong friendships become really important sources of support.
Totally. And speaking of support systems, this chapter delves into those sometimes tricky family relationships, particularly that ever-changing bond between adults and their parents.
It's definitely a two-way street, right? Emerging adults are striving for independence, but they still lean on their parents for guidance. And as parents get older, they often benefit from the care and help their adult children can provide. It's this back and forth that shifts as time goes on.
It makes me think about the idea of fictive kin that the chapter brings up. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, it's basically expanding the definition of family, right? Fictive kin are those people who aren't related by blood or marriage, but they're still considered family. They offer that sense of belonging, especially for those who might be estranged from their biological families or don't have as many close social connections.
So it's like building a chosen family based on shared values and close bonds.
Exactly. And this can be so important for folks who might not have those strong ties to their biological families, or maybe they just crave a wider support network.
That's a really beautiful idea, this deep human need for connection and belonging. Now, switching gears a bit, this chapter also talks about generativity, that whole feeling of giving back to the next generation or making a real difference in the world.
Right. Generativity is often expressed through becoming a parent, but this chapter highlights that it's not the only way. We can find that sense of purpose by caring for others through our work or even through creative pursuits that leave a lasting legacy behind.
It's like there are so many ways to leave our mark on the world. And speaking of parenthood, this chapter digs into all the ups and downs of raising kids.
From those first few years when you're totally bonded with your baby, to those teenage years where independence and figuring out who you are really takes center stage, parenting is this constant evolution, and it often makes couples rethink traditional gender roles, even those who really value equality.
It's amazing how being a parent can challenge those ingrained ideas we have and push us to grow in ways we never expected. And the chapter also acknowledges that there are many different ways to be a parent. Adoption, step parenting, and foster parenting. Each one comes with its own unique set of challenges and requires an incredible amount of dedication to building a strong family.
For sure. And we can't forget about the huge role grandparents play, too. They bring this unique mix of wisdom, love, and, let's be honest, sometimes a little bit of spoiling.
But as the chapter points out, sometimes grandparents end up being the primary caregivers, right? Dealing with unexpected challenges when they become the heads of these skipped generation families.
Yeah, it's truly a testament to their love and dedication, even in the face of some really tough situations. And that kind of leads us to this idea of king keepers, those folks who make sure everyone in the family stays connected across generations. They're the ones holding it all together.
It sounds like a lot of responsibility. Does that tie into this idea of the sandwich generation? Those folks who are stuck taking care of their own kids and their aging parents at the same time.
That's actually a pretty common misconception. While some middle-aged adults do end up providing care for both their children and their parents, it's not as common as we might think. And we also need to remember that caregiving can go both ways. Older adults often provide a lot of support to their adult kids, whether it's financial or emotional, even as they might need a little extra help themselves.
So it's more about this network of support that changes over time with different family members stepping in as needed.
Exactly. It's all about recognizing that families are these dynamic systems where everyone contributes in their own way throughout their lives.
Now, we can't talk about adulthood without talking about work.
Definitely, work is such a central part of our lives. It's not just about the paycheck, but also about having a sense of purpose, feeling like we're contributing and connecting with others. This chapter really highlights the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards when it comes to work.
Right? Extrinsic rewards are those tangible things like salary and benefits, while intrinsic rewards are more about the personal satisfaction we get from doing the work itself. It seems like those intrinsic rewards are really key when it comes to being happy with your job and feeling good overall.
Absolutely. When we find work that feels meaningful, aligns with our values, and lets us use our skills and talents, it makes a huge difference in our happiness and motivation.
But let's be real, finding that perfect balance between having a fulfilling job and a great personal life can be tough. This chapter talks about how the workplace is changing so rapidly with more diversity and these non-standard work schedules. All these trends create both opportunities and challenges for people who are trying to manage all their different roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, the workforce is becoming more diverse, which is great for inclusivity, but it also means that employers and employees need to be aware of those cultural differences and sensitive to everyone's needs.
And with so much change happening so quickly, from the gig economy to working remotely, it really makes you think about work-life balance, job security, and even those social connections we form through work.
This chapter points out how changing jobs frequently can actually disrupt those important social networks and create a sense of instability. It also talks about how unemployment can have a devastating effect on mental and physical health. And those effects can ripple out to families, too.
And those ripple effects can extend to families when people have to work non-standard schedules like evenings or weekends.
Right.
Right? Those schedules can really disrupt family routines, limit quality time together, and make it hard to handle childcare and other responsibilities. It's a real balancing act, and this chapter acknowledges how hard it is to find that sweet spot.
Absolutely. It makes you question whether that whole idea of having it all is even realistic. Or maybe it's more about making choices and compromises that feel right for you and your values and priorities.
That's such a good point. It's easy to get caught up in what society expects from us and feel pressured to achieve this mythical version of success that doesn't really exist. Maybe it's more about finding that balance that works for us as individuals, rather than chasing an ideal that's impossible to reach.
Exactly. And this chapter encourages us to be critical of those societal expectations and think about how they might be shaping the way we view adulthood. It even suggests that our personalities, whether we tend to be optimistic or pessimistic, can influence how we see these issues.
It's not just about the facts, but about how we interpret those facts based on our own experiences and perspectives. And it brings up an interesting question. Is adulthood better now than it used to be?
That's a complex question with no easy answer. This chapter presents data that could support both sides of the argument. We've seen progress in areas like gender equality, reduced discrimination, and more options for romantic partnerships. But at the same time, we're facing challenges like economic inequality, climate change, and the growing demands of balancing work and life.
So it's a mixed bag. We've made some strides in certain areas,
Yeah.
but new obstacles have popped up.
Right. And it's important to acknowledge both the progress and the challenges as we navigate adulthood. This chapter reminds us that there's no one right way to be an adult. It's an ongoing journey of growing, adapting, and figuring out what works for each of us.
It's like we're all figuring it out as we go along, trying to find our own paths. Now let's dive into some of the specific findings about social media use among adults. It's definitely a force that's shaping relationships and communication these days.
Oh yeah, for sure. The data shows a pretty clear generational divide. Millennials are the most active users, with almost 90% owning smartphones and 85% on social media. Compare that to only about 28% of the silent generation, those born before 1945, who use social media.
That makes sense. Social media is just such a part of life for younger generations, while older adults might have adopted it later on or just prefer more traditional ways of communicating.
Yeah, it's not just about access to technology, but how different generations integrate social media into their lives and social circles.
Right. And while Facebook is still the most popular platform with about two-thirds of U.S. adults using it, what about other platforms? Are we seeing any changes in what's popular?
This chapter points out that YouTube is the only other platform used by more than half of U.S. adults, which suggests that video content is becoming more and more important for online engagement, particularly for those younger generations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Video is so engaging and immersive. It's no wonder it's becoming such a dominant form of communication and entertainment. But what about how social media use has changed over time? Has it just steadily increased across all age groups?
That's where it gets really interesting. The data shows a big increase in social media use across all age groups over the past 15 years. Like back in 2005, only about 1% of adults 65 and older use social media daily, but by 2018, that number had jumped to 40%.
Wow, that's a huge jump. Even though older adults might not be using social media as much as younger generations, they're definitely catching up.
Absolutely. And this trend is likely to continue as social media becomes even more integrated into our daily lives and provides new ways to connect, share information, and stay plugged into the world.
It's so fascinating to see how technology shapes our social landscape and how different generations adapt to those changes. It really makes you wonder if social media is actually strengthening or weakening those crucial social connections that are so important for adults.
That's a question researchers are still trying to figure out. There are good arguments on both sides. Some studies suggest that social media can help us stay in touch with loved ones who are far away and even create new relationships with people who share our interests.
It's kind of a double-edged sword, right? It can bring us together,
Yeah.
but it also has the potential to lead to isolation if we're not
Yes,
careful.
exactly. Some experts worry that spending too much time on social media could lead to feeling isolated, comparing ourselves to others, and having fewer face-to-face interactions. It's all about finding that healthy balance and making sure technology enhances our lives instead of taking away from those real connections that truly make us feel good.
Well said. And, speaking of those meaningful connections, this chapter circles back to the importance of intimacy and generativity throughout
Oh,
adulthood.
for sure. It's like they're woven into the fabric of adult life.
Definitely. And it emphasizes that they're not limited to specific stages or milestones. They're ongoing processes that we navigate throughout our lives.
Exactly. It's a reminder that adulthood isn't some destination. It's an ongoing journey of growth, change, and connection.
Couldn't agree more. And that journey is shaped by so many things. Our personalities, our cultural backgrounds, our relationships, the work we do.
Absolutely. It's this intricate dance between the choices we make and those societal influences that ultimately shape who we are and where we end up.
It makes me rethink all that advice we give young people about finding their passion and chasing their dreams. This chapter suggests that maybe it's not always about having some grand plan. Maybe it's more about staying open to new possibilities and adapting to change, and even discovering fulfillment in unexpected places.
That's a really valuable perspective. Life rarely goes exactly as planned, right? There are always going to be unexpected twists and turns and challenges, and even those serendipitous moments that can lead us down exciting new paths.
Yeah, it's all about embracing the journey, right?
Sure.
Learning from our experiences, building resilience, and finding those things that bring us joy and meaning along the way.
Beautifully said. And this chapter reminds us that even though there are these common threads and challenges that many adults face, everyone's journey is ultimately unique. There's no single right way to navigate adulthood. It's about discovering what works for you, honoring your own values and priorities, and creating a life that feels authentic and fulfilling.
It really is a journey of self-discovery.
Mhm.
Now, I'm curious about this concept of successful aging that the chapter touches on. What does that really mean? Is it about avoiding illness and staying active, or is there something more to it?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is multifaceted. While physical health is definitely important, successful aging is about so much more. It includes mental and emotional well-being, social engagement, and having a sense of purpose and fulfillment.
So it's not just about surviving. It's about truly thriving.
Exactly. It's about approaching the aging process with a positive attitude, staying connected to those who matter most, and finding those things that bring us joy every day.
That makes a lot of sense, and it challenges those negative stereotypes we often have about getting older. This chapter suggests that those later years can be just as rich and fulfilling as any other time in life.
Absolutely. And as we dive into the next chapters, we'll be exploring those later stages in more detail, looking at the unique challenges and opportunities that come with aging.
I'm really looking forward to continuing this exploration. It feels like we've opened a door to a whole new understanding of adulthood and all the different paths it can take.
Me too. I think this chapter has given us a solid foundation for those discussions. It reminds us that although aging is a natural part of life, It doesn't have to be a decline. It can be a time of continued growth, connection, and discovery.
Well said.
Yeah.
Now, for you, our listeners, what does this all mean? We've seen that adulthood is a tapestry woven from those threads of personality relationships and the impact we make on the world. Each of those threads contributes to the richness and complexity of who we are.
Absolutely. You've given us so much to think about, and we've only just scratched the surface. As you continue your own journey through adulthood, remember to embrace the changes, nurture your connections, and find those things that set your soul on fire, things that give you that sense of purpose.
And above all, stay curious. Stay adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
Life is a constant learning process, and each stage brings new opportunities for growth and fulfillment.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That wraps up our deep dive into adulthood, but the exploration doesn't have to end here. Remember, you're still writing your own story. What choices will you make to shape the chapters to come?
Yeah, it really is a journey, isn't it? This whole process of growing and changing. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface with this chapter. There's so much more to learn as we keep moving forward.
Definitely. It's like we've opened this door to a whole new way of looking at adulthood and all the different directions it can take. And I think this chapter has given us some really valuable insights to carry with us.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. It's clear that adulthood is this multi-layered experience, shaped by our choices, our personalities, and those connections we make along the way.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about as we continue on our own journeys.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, we hope this exploration has sparked some new ideas and inspired you to embrace all the adventures that adulthood has to offer.
Remember, you're still writing your own story. Every choice you make shapes what comes next. So stay curious, stay connected, and keep searching for those things that bring you joy and purpose.
Beautifully said. And that wraps up our deep dive into adulthood. But the learning doesn't stop here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep creating a life that truly reflects who you are.